Hey guys, so in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the English colonization of North America. We've already discussed the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Khan Academy video looked at the French and the Dutch colonization. But the English, compared to those other countries, are kind of late to starting a colony in North America. Um, there's multiple reasons for this. England was going through a civil war. They were sometimes fighting with the Irish during this time, so they had a lot of war efforts and things going on. Back in Europe, they didn't have the resources to send colonizers and send explorers out to North America. However, by the late 1500s and early 1600s, things began to change. Some of the things are changing in England itself. And we're going to talk about push and pull factors of immigration, because we're going to be using this model of talking about immigration later on in this class, and you'll talk about it in American too as well. And it's still something that is talked about today. And push and pull factors are exactly kind of what they sound like. Push factors are things that make you kind of want to push you away from the country that you're in. So that can be land scarcity, religious or political persecution, political revolution, so war in your country, poverty, and weather, natural disasters, things like that. And so all of these things were going on in England during this time. Pull factors, the reasons that make you want to go to another country might be freedom, maybe more religious or political freedom, a new life, jobs, land, and resources. So those are all things that will make you want to go to another place. And so some of the things that are pushing people out of England during this time, a big one is land scarcity. If you remember back to when we talked about the Columbian Exchange, those crops that were brought back to Europe, such as like potatoes and corn, those crops can feed a lot of people. And therefore, we see a population increase in Europe. And that contributes to this land scarcity. There's just simply not enough land to go around and for everyone to have their own farm. And so a lot of people move to the cities, and these cities really don't have many jobs. And the wages are really low during this time period in England and the major cities. Also, we have religious persecution. So during this time, there's an establishment of the Church of England, and the Church of England kind of models a lot after Catholicism, and a lot of the population of England has converted over to Protestantism. Remember, we talked a little bit about the Reformation and that split in the Christian church, and so they're not allowed to practice their own religions freely in England. They still have to, tithe, pay money to the Church of England, even though they don't necessarily agree with the religious practices. And then we're going to switch over to pull factors. So here in North America, people had a lot more freedom than they did back in Europe. They didn't have a king or a queen watching over, what they were doing. And also, there wasn't this established aristocracy in North America. Eventually, that'll happen, but in the beginning, that really wasn't here. It was kind of every man trying to eke out their own living in North America. Whereas back in Europe, you have, families that had been wealthy for hundreds of years that, controlled certain parts of the country. And, your chances of moving up, either economically or socially, were very limited back in Europe, but not as limited here in North America. Again, you got that new life that you can look forward to. You might be able to move up kind of in the world, so to speak. There was a lot more land here in North America, obviously, than back in England. I mean, the country of England, compared to the size of the United States, the whole entire country of England is, about the size of South Carolina. And then you think about how big the United States is outside of that. So a lot more land, and a lot of that land has very good resources. So there's a lot more resources here in North America than there was back in England. In England, they had used up a lot of their resources. A lot of the forests had been cleared for farmland, and there wasn't as much timber, there wasn't as much game, there wasn't just those raw materials to really be economically profitable. Everything in England really had to be imported. So, kind of hitting on those push and pull factors and continuing on that, some reasons for colonization, and probably one of the most common reasons for people to leave England and come to North America was financial. It's simple that, like I said before, in England, your chances of moving up economically were really limited. But over here in North America, you had a chance where if you could get a few acres, you might be able to start growing, enough food to feed your family, but you might be able to start growing some tobacco or some cotton or indigo or rice. These crops that made a lot of money on the international market. You could make a lot of money if you could get those crops back over to Europe and sell them. So there was this chance to make money. And the second one is going to be religion. And with religion, it was mainly in the fact that if you came to North America, you and your community really got to decide what religion to practice. We'll talk more about this when we talk about New England and the Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony. We'll talk more about that when we get to talking about New England specifically. The expansion of the British Empire. So Britain realizes, or the English realize that they don't have quite the foothold here in the Americas. They don't have these colonies that are making them a lot of money like the French, the Dutch, or the Spanish or Portuguese. And they look at this as kind of like a military threat. If your enemies, and Britain and France have always been longtime enemies, if your enemy's becoming a lot more wealthier than you, you may be in trouble. They can fund a bigger army, fund more ships, and so England sees the need to start getting or establishing colonies to make money. And then again, the start of a new life here in North America. So the first English colony is unsuccessful. You guys have probably heard of Roanoke Island. So in 1587, they tried to establish the first colony. It obviously did not work out. As I said, it's the first unsuccessful colony. So what happens with the lost colony? Well, some people think that they were slaughtered by Native Americans. Some think they went to go live with the Native Americans. And some just think that they could have, starved out and not had enough food due to the harsh weather. So I believe it was John White. He was the captain that brought this colony over. And there's only a few hundred of them, 200-300 Englishmen and women that are trying to get this colony started. And they kind of arrive late and they don't have enough time to grow their food for the winter. And so what they end up having to do is send John White back to England in order to get more supplies to bring back to the colonies. That way, they can have enough food and supplies to survive. Well, when John White gets to England, though, England is actually fighting a war with France, and the British officers in England seize his ship. They say, "Oh, well, we're taking your ship to help fight in the war." And so it's not until 3 years later, after the war is over, that he's able to get his ship back and bring it back to the colony and bring them supplies. But by that time, when he arrives, everything is overgrown. Some of the people's belongings are scattered around, and the only evidence that was left was CRO carved in a tree. And they think that meant the local Indians, who they sometimes called themselves Crow. And so they never found, their loved ones. John White's family actually stayed behind in the colony while he went to England. And so, he lost his wife and children. So nobody quite knows exactly what happened. Most people kind of lean towards they probably went to either go live with Native Americans, whether that was by force or by choice. Nobody quite knows, and probably will never know exactly how things transpired with that first colony. But now we're going to switch to the first successful colony. I say successful kind of loosely here because Jamestown, in the first few years, almost 50% of the settlers there died. So it was very hard to start a colony, as you can see, here in North America, and especially further south in places like North Carolina and Virginia. And Jamestown was established in what is now Virginia. So in 1607, they start the colony of Jamestown. John Smith, you guys probably remember that from the Pocahontas movie. However, he didn't actually marry Pocahontas we'll talk about the guy that actually did. So the reason for the colony was for money. And we'll actually kind of build upon this as we go, and you can see the differences in the first few colonies in the first few English colonies in North America, and the reasons for being established, and kind of a difference that we'll see divide more and more as we go through this class between North and South. But nonetheless, they started by joint stock companies. That's where multiple people invest their money in order to try to get a profit out of the colony. So they want to see crops being exported. They want to export resources back to Europe. The first few people that come over are generally indentured servants. So you'd have people. Well, we'll talk more about indentured servants actually later. So the hardships of Jamestown. So you have too many men, not enough women. So there's a lot of fighting going on there. There's not enough people there to kind of reproduce and have a population grow in Jamestown. Also, you have no gold. It's not producing much money. And then you have the starving time, which was actually the first 2 years. They had harsh winters. They weren't able to get enough food. And close to half of all colonizers in Jamestown will die due to starvation. So I'm going to skip the vocabulary. Major contributions of Jamestown was the development of tobacco. So tobacco is what will save Jamestown Colony. So John Rolfe, he's actually the one who married Pocahontas. He figures out how to grow tobacco very well in and around Jamestown. Again, what today would be Virginia. And so as he starts to learn how to grow tobacco and other settlers follow suit, they realize that they can start making money. The colony is becoming profitable. And now more people back in England are wanting to invest in the colony, to send more supplies, to send more ships, and more people. And as I had mentioned before, I'm going to talk about indentured servants. So before the African slave trade was really brought to the south of what would become the United States, the first people to work on these early plantations were indentured servants. And so these were poor Europeans that wanted to come to the colonies but could not afford to come. Again, if you were one of those poor people that I talked about earlier living in England, a poor man or woman who didn't inherit any land, didn't have a farm, and you go to the city trying to find a job, and you either got a really crappy paying job, or you're pretty much barely getting by. You're living in poverty. You're living a very hard life. So what you could do is you could sign a contract with a plantation owner here in the Americas and say, or they would pay for you to come here. But once you got here, you were forced to work for that plantation owner for 3 to 5, even some could be as long as 7 years. So you had to work on the plantation for that long. You couldn't leave. Pretty much you almost became property of the plantation owner, but you still had certain rights, unlike African slavery, which we'll talk about later. And so here you can see where the colonies are located. The lost colony of Roanoke was off the coast of North Carolina. Jamestown will be in Virginia. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the colony at Plymouth. Plymouth Colony is a little bit more famous, and that's because, that's where the Pilgrims landed. They were separatists. They came here for religious reasons, not the economic reasons that people went to Jamestown. People went to Plymouth to escape religious persecution. So they also had early hardships, and that was mainly cold weather. They had to deal with much more cold weather at Plymouth than they did in Jamestown. But both of them weren't able to grow enough food in order to sustain the people there. And so there was a lot of starvation that went on in these early English colonies. The major contributions was the Mayflower Compact. We'll actually be working with that document in Canvas this week. But the Mayflower Compact is fundamentally important because it is the first form of American democracy. And we'll talk more about that when we actually read parts of the Mayflower Compact. Also, the idea of self-government and majority rule, things that they didn't quite have back in England. And so William Bradford, he is one of the people that you need to know for vocabulary, born in England, and he is Plymouth's first governor. Once William Bradford kind of takes control, he is able to kind of turn the colony around. He pretty much makes it to where, because a lot of these early colonists were looking for things like, let's see if we can find some gold. Let's go try to rob a Native American village and steal some of their food. And so he kind of cracks down on everybody and says, if you aren't working, you're not going to eat. And so he doesn't necessarily force them, but he pretty much says we all have to work together in order to produce enough food so that we're not starving to death when the winter comes. So there is a copy of the Mayflower Compact. It was a document that they signed before they ever even set foot on American soil. Again, the Mayflower Compact was that first governing document of what would become the United States, signed by 41 men on the Mayflower, and they agreed to be governed by the leaders chosen by the people and agreed to obey all laws that were made. And this is going to be a fundamental difference between Plymouth Colony and Jamestown Colony, because Plymouth Colony has this law and government and order in place, and they're actually going to become a lot more stable than Jamestown, where people were more focused on just trying to make money and not necessarily focused on working together. And these things will carry on as we talk more about the development of these two places. So I'm kind of going to go through this pretty quick. Puritans, Massachusetts Bay Colony. We'll talk about some of the dissenters from the Puritan authority. So we have John Winthrop. His famous speech is "A City Upon a Hill." Many presidents have cited this speech by John Winthrop before. He pretty much says that the colony that they are creating should be a model colony and a model, society for other worlds to follow. And presidents in the past have used this quote of "City Upon a Hill" to describe the United States, that we should be a country for other countries to model themselves after. And so it's still something that you'll hear, if any president or politician brings up the idea of a city upon a hill, that's what they mean. That the United States should be a model for the rest of the world to follow. He led the first group of Puritans in Massachusetts. First governor of Massachusetts. Then you have Roger Williams, who breaks away from the colony. His major thing is that he starts Rhode Island Colony. So now we have three different colonies in the north. You have Plymouth Colony, then you have Massachusetts Bay Colony, and now we have Rhode Island. Rhode Island was by far the most religiously tolerant. You pretty much could practice all forms of Christianity in Rhode Island. In Massachusetts, you had to practice the ideas of the Puritans. You didn't have that religious freedom. Also in Plymouth, they were strongly, controlled what church was like, and church and government were not separated. Roger Williams was one of the first people to really put out this idea of a separation between church and state, like we have today. And this idea comes from Roger Williams. The founding fathers looked back to the establishment of places like Rhode Island and their laws, and said we should adopt this and have this separation of religion and government. And so I will let you guys look more at this yourself. I mean, this is just comparing the different colonies that I've talked about. I'll put this slide on Canvas too, so that way you guys can flip through it. The House of Burgesses, I will actually talk more about them when we talk, more about the Constitution. But the House of Burgesses is the first legislative body, was in Virginia, and they could make laws, raise taxes, but the governor had the final say. So the House of Burgesses is important because it is that first legislative body. Things like the colonial assemblies would come much later. New Amsterdam, you guys heard about that in the Khan Academy video. This would become what is now New York City. And New Amsterdam was established pretty much to trade in the fur trade with the Manhattan Indians that were on the island. Then we have William Penn. He will establish the colony of Pennsylvania, which will be kind of the middle colonies between the South and the North. And he wanted a religiously tolerant colony. So Pennsylvania, again, was pretty religiously tolerant. Um, he was a wealthy Quaker. We'll talk more about that later when I talk about the differences between the different regions. And so that is the end of the English colonial lecture. This is just the beginning. We're going to kind of dive more in the next few lectures about the actual differences between the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the northern colonies, and how those differences will influence the United States all the way up to the Civil War. So as always, if you have any questions, just let me know.